My name is Cecilia Waldenström and I will be talking about agrarian change in Sweden. And my focus is on agrarian change as a changing context for construction of knowledge in agriculture. So I will talk about this over time in a way. I've been working with issues of rural development and agrarian change in Sweden mainly, and also been a bit involved in the European Rural Development Program evaluations and in LEADER and things like that. I will start with a brief history of agrarian change in Sweden. In the late 18th and during the 19th century, there were a series of land reforms in Sweden breaking up old village collaborative tilling, even moving whole farms from the villages out into the landscape. Early in 19th century, the Royal Academy of Agriculture was established, and over time also regional county-based agricultural societies in which the local gentry were active to reform agricultural practices and support rural welfare. So this was a Swedish version of agrarian change and changes of crop production systems that came in the 19th century. In Sweden, there was a lot of ditching and draining, recuperating new agricultural land, and then the change in the whole system with the new kinds of crop rotation, growing lay on fields, better use of manure, breeding programs, and new kinds of tools and machinery. In due course, this led to a biologically balanced cultivation system which lasted in its main outlines until the 1940s, and an increase of agricultural land from approximately 850,000 hectares to 3.5 million hectares at the end of the century. In the next century, there was then another change in cultivation system. In the early decades, there was a series of organizational reforms in the institutions around agriculture which were important for the development in Sweden. And the economic crisis in the 1930s led to cooperatives for different kinds of production, for instance, dairy, grain, potatoes, sugar beets. And the farmers who were part of the cooperatives sold to the cooperatives. The cooperatives handled the price regulations, but the state had to support agriculture. During the Second World War, negotiations on prices and productions between the state and the Federation of Swedish Farmers were developed. And in principle, these two systems lasted until the 1990s. This means that Swedish agriculture was both protected and supported, basically. In 1947, another change was that an agricultural policy was established. Earlier, there had been no such policies because Sweden was basically a rural country, so economic policies and rural policies would be the same. But now a policy came to rationalize agriculture, to increase production, and to give farmers better incomes through pricing, advisory systems, loans, and property right regulation. You couldn't just buy and sell land as you wanted. There were very specific ideas about what a farm should look like and who should be allowed to farm. And there were county boards of agriculture established to implement these policies. So the decades in the middle of the 20th century was a fast transformation of agriculture and the rural economy, and a fast industrialization in Sweden, and also an urbanization. Up to the 1980s, I think that we had an urbanization which reached 80% in the 1980s. And this is where we are, more or less, still. Policies were adapted, of course, but the main focus was on rationalization up to the 1980s. And here you can see how fast the change was. If you look at the number of farm holdings that diminished by almost 80%, and the arable land where almost 1 million hectares went out of production. Early on, this went mainly to forestry. Nowadays, the agricultural land is still diminishing, but now it goes to urban sprawl, and of course, in the forested areas of Sweden, the farms are still being closed down and land abandoned, or for structural reasons on other farms or nature reserves. the big portion of taking land out of agriculture was in the mid 20th century. The proportion of economic actively population in agriculture is around 1% now, where it was 20% in the 50s, and at the beginning of that century, of course, much larger. The number of dairy cows have gone down from 1.5 million to about 300,000. But when you look at those numbers, you should remember that in the 1950s, the herd size was around 20 cows, and now it's almost 100 cows. So the number of farms with dairy cows has decreased enormously. Milk yield and winter wheat yield have tripled during this time, more or less, or doubled. Winter wheat doesn't increase much anymore, although there are technological advancements which are supposed to increase yield. There are other things in the agroecological context which counter those endeavors. So that has reached the maximum, it seems. This new cultivation system then, as we probably all know, already built on the early electrification of the countrysides, the mechanization or fossilization, you could say, the chemicalization, and all this led to specialization and to a very capital-intensive farming system. In the 1980s and 90s, as I said, these policies started to break down. This was due to overproduction. It also changes regarding the role of the state, which led to a reevaluation of policies. The county agricultural boards were closed down and parts of their tasks integrated in the county administration. The public advisory system was dismantled. Production advice should be provided by the sector and by industry. Price negotiations between the state and farmers stopped, and early 1990s, Sweden prepared to deregulate agriculture completely. But alas, in 1995, Sweden instead joined the European Union, and thus farming came into the common agricultural policy and the regulations in that policy. So how do farmers handle the changes? We have recently made a qualitative study on agrarian change and farm household strategies, in which we interviewed 40 farmers who tilled the same land as farm households did in a survey in 1992, which I happen to be part of as well. And now we're making a thematic analysis in relation to how farmers relate to the future, especially climate change. That is Erik Westholm doing that. Gender relations, especially changing masculinities. Camilla Eriksson, farming household livelihood, Flora Heidö, and agrarian change and conditions for the construction of knowledge, which then is my theme. We have been doing these interviews in 3 study areas. The northern area, one in the mid-Swedish plains, and one in the southern plains of Sweden. If you look at the study areas, you can see that their size differ very much, but that is because that in the original survey, the sampling was drawn from municipalities, and municipalities in Sweden build on the population. And as northern Sweden is much more sparsely populated, the municipalities become much bigger. In the northern area, where you cannot grow wheat, for instance, you can grow oats and barley, but it's not very good for crop production on the whole. Instead, the grazing is important for farming here. So it's mainly an extensive farming, and the further inland you go, the more extensive, and a low input farming. Many farmers own forest here as well, and forestry is important to their economy. Forestry is much more profitable than farming. Mid-Swedish plains have a good precondition for farming on both crop and livestock. It's a landscape type where there is grazing land as well as plains for crop production. And southern plains of Sweden is Sweden's most productive agricultural region with the best soils and mainly crop farming. The landscape allows for large-scale farming. Actually, in Sweden, the main agriculture production is from the very south, and also from, you see the yellow parts in mid-Sweden. So when we looked at strategies, how the farms handle price squeeze and decreasing returns, Sweden, we sell our agriculture produced to world market prices, and the food industry is well linked into sort of international networks. And Sweden doesn't have the best preconditions in the world for farm production, and food industry tends to want to squeeze the prices. So there is a continuing price squeeze for farmers. Some then go for increased labor productivity and large-scale production, bulk production. That is obviously mostly on the plains, possible on the plains. Others focus more on cost efficiency to get more influence over the price through trading your harvests on Chicago Paris markets, organic production. You can get a higher price for that, and value-adding processes on farms, such as making goat cheese. Collaboration with consumers and finding alternative food networks, selling not through the ordinary sort of food regimes, but going directly to your end consumer and coupling up with consumers. You can change to less labor demanding production to get more time for others. That is one reason, one of many reasons from going from dairy to meat production. Diversifying, building on on-farm resources, and also getting other kinds of income. You can say that getting other kinds of income has been the basis for much farms in northern Sweden on the whole, historically and forever, because the farms have been too small to only live on farming. Very low intensity, aiming to stay on the farm, just sort of getting the basic farm support, which you get for keeping land open within the European Union. Combinations are of course common, and contextual preconditions on many levels matter. It could just be the interest you have, the landscape, preconditions, traditions in the region, and rural economy, what alternatives are there? Health, age, and generation shift coming up. There are many different factors which matter the kind of strategies you choose. And I can say that this is in line with other research on how farmers stay on the farm today in Europe. But I've been looking at this as context for construction of knowledge. One of the first things you think about when you think about learning about agriculture and farming is, of course, other farmers. Neighbors who farm, local culture of farming, and collaboration amongst farmers. What is there in a region of that? In the north, there were less and less farmers, longer distances to farmers, for instance. Are there agricultural schools in the region? When we did the 1990 survey, there were schools in all the regions, but today there is only in the two southernmost. What are the advisory services offered? Are there advisory services? What kind of secondary industries and food industries are there? They are very much part of the construction of knowledge and construction. As they have quality concerns, they may have some advisory services. Some of them try to really get the kind of integrated production with the farms to get the produce they want for their industries. Agricultural research centers in the region. Are there such research going on, and how does that connect to the farmers? What is the focus of the research? Are other actors engaged in the production? Are there consumers who are engaged? Are there municipalities who want to keep production or to want to support a specific kind of production and then buy produce from specific farmers? If you look at the kind of learning theories that are used in rural research, which would be communities of practice, social learning, agricultural knowledge and information systems, and activity theory, which I work with, which is as common, you can see that all these theories sort of handle these kinds of actors and relations between them, and how they communicate, and how knowledge is built in the intersections in these settings. So if you look at the three study areas, in the southern area there was plenty of advisory services, much research on agriculture and food. In fact, this university has a whole campus here that does such research. There are many food industries and other secondary industries who tie up farmers to them. Quite a lot of farmers which we interviewed had university diploma in agriculture. You can say that this part is a Swedish frontline in conventional farming practices, but also research going on agroecology and farmers applying such practices and who sort of form a little hub of knowledge around that. The mid-Swedish area was well provided in advisory services, food industry and secondary industries as well. Less research, but there is also a small campus doing research there. And that has been leading in the development of precision farming on the whole. This depends on people working in the agricultural society there and the researchers who have had the interest and technological competence to develop that. So they have been world leading in precision farming. The northern area then, there we saw a breakdown of institutional context for farming. There are fewer farmers, less relationships between farmers, there are no agricultural school, the advisory systems are very distant and not so active. Some farmers who really wanted advice sought that from outside the region. Two of those I interviewed had contacts with advisors in Finland, and some had in southern Sweden. And there were some who were building their own infrastructure. There was, for instance, a local cooperative who had built a small abattoir of their own. They had developed their own alternative food networks for selling the meat, and they had a study circle on meat production for people who wanted to start up meat production but who did not come from farming originally. Education in agriculture was not common. So the kind of knowledge developed here had to do with small-scale farming and building new local and long-distance networks. So you can see that in the 19th century there was a change in cultivation system to a more biologically based one, but it was built on state intervention which was decisive, and local gentry was important over time to support this. In the 20th century there was also a change in cultivation system, with the state, the industry and farming cooperatives were actually all three heralding this. Now in the 21st century a new change is sorely needed for many reasons. One amongst those reasons is climate change. Here is a map of climate change impact on agriculture which is expected. You can see that the coastal zones, sea level rise, intrusion of salt water are two of the things expected. The Atlantic region, increase in heavy precipitation, risk of flooding, winter storms. Mediterranean region, extreme heat and risk of droughts. An expected decrease of production, also an extensification of production. The boreal region, then, increase in heavy precipitation and winter storms, but an increase in crop yields. Continental region, heat extremes and river floods, and decrease in summer precipitation. Mountain regions, temperatures will go up more than average, shift of plant and animal species, risk of hail, frost, rockfalls, and landslides. So these are just some of the risks which we are facing for agricultural systems. In the EU report on climate change adaptation in the agricultural sector, there is a long list of farm-level practices that need to change. Some of these are practices that some farmers already practice, but very few on the whole do that. And in the report they write that farm advisory services and adaptation are essential. If you look at the preparations for the coming CAP program period, there is a focus on innovation and these agricultural knowledge and information systems and a mix of support measures, but I think that that is not at all enough. So the basic questions remain. What are the means and ways for changing the production system in the 21st century? Who will be the main actors in the food systems today who could pursue such a change? Who will farm and where and on what land? Where will the preconditions for farming be good? If you look at northern Sweden, which then is an area where you expect an increase of farming, we don't have the infrastructure for any sort of agricultural knowledge and information system left, and not people who are interested or able in farming. So who will farm and where? Who will farm? Who will build up farming there? We need a new kind of agrarianization. I think that's my last word, but how will that be realized? Thank you very much.